Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ivan Grek. I'm a co-director of the Russia program at the George Washington University's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And today I'm pleased to welcome you to our event where David Lewis will introduce a new report showing how Russia is using economic and financial tools to consolidate its control of the occupied territories of Ukraine. So David Lewis is professor of global politics at the University of Exeter. His recent research has focused on the politics of authoritarianism, including the book Russia's New Authoritarianism, Putin and the Politics of Order, published with the Edinburgh University Press in 2020. His forthcoming book, Occupation, Russia's Military Regime in Southeastern Ukraine, will be published by Hearst in 2024. Before joining the politics department at Exeter, David worked in the Department of Peace Studies at Bradford University and for the International Crisis Group in Central Asia and in Sri Lanka. During 2019-22, he was on the secondment as a research fellow at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So I'm happy to have David with us presenting his new excellent research, which is extremely important, not only in terms of the content per se, but methods, how we can approach stuff these days, especially in those inaccessible regions. So as for our format, please free to write your questions, comments, and suggestions in chat to the Zoom meeting, to group or to me, depending on sort of a comment you have. I'll collect all the questions and address them to David after his talk. So also, we'll make David's report available at our website at therussia.program.org. And we'll have all our websites and social networks published in chat. They just appeared right now. So please subscribe to find any updates. And as we just discussed with David, that's the very beginning of a long journey into further exploration of policies of Russian occupational forces. There will be more news coming. So I see that a lot of us has came and joined the conversation. So now I'm opening the floor to David Lewis.
Thanks so much. Thanks very much for the introduction, Ivan, and thanks so much for hosting us. It's incredibly good to be with you today. I want to share my screen so that I can show you a little bit of what we've been working on. We've produced this report, and I should say it's very much a collaborative experience. So we certainly, this has my name on it, but I would say there's lots of other people who have contributed, including, of course, lots of our Ukrainian colleagues as well. So this is a new report that Ivan very kindly has said he'll put on his website. It is funded by the UK Foreign Office through their Serious Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. Also, lots of other interesting work on that programme in case you might be interested in it. It is a slightly different approach to understanding Russia's occupation of southeastern Ukraine. There obviously has been a good deal of work, and rightly so, on the violence that underpins the military regime. And let's not forget, all occupations and military occupations rely ultimately on violence and on coercion. And that has obviously been a fundamental part of what Russia's been doing in the war in the south and the east. We've heard numerous stories, of course, numerous reports of detentions, of torture, of kidnapping, of murder. Thousands of people, we believe, are held in places of detention even now. And I think that's very important to bear in mind when we do talk about these economic aspects of it. So we're looking at one tool in the Russian toolbox, and we always have to remember there's an underlying violence there that is the sort of fundamental basis of the occupation. Nevertheless, I think it's also important to look beyond simply the military component of what Russia is doing and think a little bit more about some of its economic aspects as well. This is the view, if you like, from Russia, looking at these occupied territories, not simply as a kind of geostrategic area and a strategic goal, but also in terms of their economic potential. You can see, if you're a Russian speaker there, the kind of areas of economic asset that Russia might be interested in. So just to remind us what we're talking about here, we're talking about these four provinces in particular of Ukraine. Obviously, Crimea is also under Russian rule, illegally annexed in 2014. I'm not going to talk too much about Crimea today, except to say, of course, it is very much a template for what's happened since 2022, and it's perhaps worth reflecting on whether more could have been done after 2014, certainly to focus in on what was happening on Crimea. Nevertheless, I'm going to focus primarily on the territories occupied since February 2022. And in terms of the nature of our report, a lot of the work is on Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. So let's look at this a little bit more widely. So although obviously violence and coercion is fundamental to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, I think it's worth bearing in mind that economics has always played this really key role, right, in Russia's toolkit of control mechanisms in wartime. Russia has developed this mechanism through which it can use all sorts of economic and financial flows, business opportunities, humanitarian aid, all the dynamics of the political economy to both co-opt support, co-opt allies in war zones and in conflict-affected areas, and also punish resistance to cut off potential financial flows to rebels and opponents. We saw this in Chechnya, of course, and Chechnya caused another laboratory really for how Russia deals with a hostile society, how it engages in both military and sort of political, economic means of what you might call occupation, and a regime there in which budget finance was distributed through these particular client networks, essentially to ensure loyalty. Syria also, we saw lots of humanitarian aid deployed, food used as a weapon, also business opportunities to try and consolidate both the government and, of course, Russian military campaign itself. And, we've seen this really developed into almost a sort of model throughout Wagner's operations in Africa, particularly in Central African Republic. So the important thing to bear in mind is that the economic side of what Russia's doing is extremely important and does have impacts on Russia's ability to consolidate control, to win over part of the population even, and certainly to undermine the support for sort of anti-Russian movements, indeed, even inside southeastern Ukraine. So having said that, let's look back. I'll just work through some of the sort of key facets of what's been going on in Ukraine since February 2022. Obviously, a lot of this will be familiar to you, but I think it's worth trying to sort of categorize this a little bit to get a model to try and understand these mechanisms more broadly. So when Russian forces first went into the south, of course, they advanced very quickly from Crimea into Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts until we had that very brutal siege of Mariupol. But even in those early periods around March, April 2022, there are numerous reports of simply looting, marauding, armed groups taking over properties and assets, a lot of equipment stolen. There was that famous story of the John Deere harvesters that ended up in Chechnya and were spotted by their sort of satellite technology. But that was simply sort of one element in a much wider campaign of simply extracting resources in that early period. Steel, for example, huge amounts of steel stolen from these big metals plants in Donbass. Metinvest estimates that in the millions of dollars. The same coal that was stored in many of those plants, again, lots of that stolen during these early months of the war. It was a bit of a free-for-all. We even heard reports of some kind of conflicts between different armed groups, different militias on the Russian side. But broadly speaking, as the summer went on in 2022, you started to get more control and, if you like, a more administrative form of plunder and looting through these occupation administrations that were set up throughout the occupied territories. In the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, you already had existing structures in place, but they've been expanded, strengthened, and much larger numbers of Russian officials have been deployed into those administrations. In Zaporizhia and Kherson, of course, Russia had to set these up from scratch. Broadly speaking, there's an FSB operation combined with the military at first, and everything revolved around the military commandant. But as time went on, you have these local pro-Russian leaders picked to head up the occupation administrations and to act really as the face of the Russian occupation. But beneath those, you saw Russian officials coming in, particularly as head of regional governments. So you had a sort of a key role there for trusted Russian officials, many of them from Sergei Kiryenko's stable of sort of younger technocrats coming in from Moscow to really manage what we've been calling a kind of administrative occupation, which has been going on in parallel to the military occupation at the same time. Of course, lots of these civilian administrators put in by Russia are heading up administrations from which the previous heads either are now in exile or, of course, in some cases were detained. Some of them are still in detention, as far as we know. So we've got to, again, bear in mind that this process of putting together these administrations, again, is based on these human rights abuses, detentions, and violence. Then, of course, we've been through this formal annexation process, these sham referendums, even by Russian standards, particularly fraudulent, held in these oblasts, then these international treaties, and then this year as a kind of formal cementing of those administrations on the ground. You had, again, even by Russian standards, particularly fraudulent elections held for these legislative assemblies in the 4 regions, and then the affirmation of those 4 heads that you see there. Vladimir Saldo from Kherson, Baklitsky from Zaporizhia, and the 2 heads of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, who were already there, of course, prior to 2022. So while all that is well known, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes I think is less well covered and less well understood, perhaps. This is a kind of huge bureaucratic process that has been going on, particularly since 30th September 2022, really over the last 12 months. It involves an awful lot of bureaucratic work, lots of it rather mundane, and therefore doesn't really hit the headlines, but it has been incredibly important, I think, in the way that Russia is trying to consolidate its control on the ground. Just yesterday, I think, or the day before, the Minister of Justice was reporting to the State Duma on all the work the Ministry of Justice has been doing over the last 12 months to incorporate these regions into the Russian Federation, into the legal structures of the Russian Federation. As you see, there are more than 50 federal laws passed to introduce these legal norms, to adapt Russian law to the incorporation of these regions. And there is a transition period in place at the moment, which runs until 1st of January 2026. And during that period, you will finally get a kind of full transition, assuming, of course, they hang on to these territories. Hopefully, they won't make it that far. But there will be a full transition to Russian laws, regulations, business, and indeed military service as well. The norms of military service will be introduced at the end of that period. And while this is going on, there's a huge transfer of Ukrainian personal corporate data into Russian registries going on. So everything from birth certificates, marriage certificates, business registration, all your personal details that might be in a state register are all going into the Russian registries as people are registered, whether they like it or not, essentially within the Russian Federation. So alongside that kind of legal process that's going on, all that regulatory work that has been at the top of the Russian agenda, we've also seen this process of nationalization of economic assets. And this, again, has been an absolutely huge process involving thousands of different companies, even greater numbers of different assets, apartments, houses, even cars, being put through this process of nationalization. And the way this has worked is essentially, as this so-called Senator Dmitry Vorona there says, this was a decision essentially to nationalize everything, as he would say, it was left behind by the people who owned it previously. So everyone who left these regions, and certainly according to Ukrainian officials, more than 50% of the population has left most of the occupied areas. So a large number of people who are affected by this personally. Those people, unless they were able to turn up and claim their property, and the demands to do that were pretty restrictive, have in many cases lost control of their property. It's been nationalized, and in some cases, a new management has been installed. So the way this has worked has been essentially every day, you get a list like this on the official site of the so-called government of Zaporizhia Oblast. And for those of you who read Russian, you'll understand what's going on here. This is a declaration of what they call ownerless property, or property that's been abandoned as they see it. Essentially means it belongs obviously to Ukrainian citizens. Those Ukrainian citizens are not able to access their property because of the Russian occupation. And so the list goes in, the list goes out, is published on the website. And as soon as, for example, I think the first one on the list there is a private house in Melitopol on Ulitsa Zaporozhskaya. It's a private house that presumably people have left empty. And that will now, the owners of that will just have 3 days in which they are supposed to claim that. And to claim it, you've got to take all your documents to an office in Melitopol. So it's very likely that that house will now be taken into national, as they say, ownership, and may also be given over to somebody else to use in the interim. So when this comes to a business in particular, what's really happened is that the authorities have brought in what they call external management, but in reality, it's been not just nationalization, but in many cases, a redistribution of property and assets to either loyal pro-Russian proxies inside the occupied territories, or more likely, business people, officials, potentially criminal networks also coming from Russia and coming from Crimea, and seizing some of this property and taking over what they would see as ownership of it. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Some of these are quite well known. So for example, Tokmak Granite Quarry in Zaporizhia Oblast. In June 2022, Russian forces, accompanied by the local occupation authorities, turned up at the mine. They told the management they would have to cooperate with Russian forces and what Russia wanted the business to do. They refused to do so, and essentially the management was removed, and a new director was put in place. And the company was re-registered, right, in Russian corporate records with a new founder. New founder is a company called Center for Economic Cooperation, the Republics, a Crimea-based firm, very well connected politically, and something that's already been active in banking and trade with the so-called DNR and LNR in the past. And what we're actually seeing is quite a number of these companies who were already active, particularly in Crimea and in occupied parts of the Donbass, but they're now expanding their networks, expanding their business opportunities into Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast as well. And these are figures who have pretty good connections, both in Moscow and often with the military on the ground. And the military has been quite deeply involved in some of these, particularly in this seizure of Zaporizhia iron ore plant, for example. There you can still see they still have a website up, but in the Russian corporate database, you will see this with a new name, the Dniepro-Rudny iron ore plant. There, I think the ownership is not indicated, but there's a new Russian director in place who, according to media reports, has close ties to the Russian military. So again, you see military being used to seize control, but then you have this legal and economic process, administrative process, in which the plant is essentially re-registered with new ownership and new management, and indeed in this case with a new name. Lots of the workers, of course, stay on. A lot of the workforce don't have much choice in where to go, and we can come on to that perhaps a little bit later on, what that means for them going forward. Third one in this sort of sector, obviously the biggest prize in the region has been these big metals plants and mining opportunities. MK plant, a very famous, huge plant in Mariupol, belonging to Metinvest. Akhmetov owns a lot of these plants in the east, of course. According to Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechen militias are now, as he put it, I think, managing the security of this plant. So it's been re-registered again in Russian records with a CEO who appears to have links into Chechnya. And in case there was any doubt about who runs this plant, there's a big portrait of Ramzan Kadyrov over the front entrance. So a plant named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin has ended up with a Chechen warlord's portrait being on the front entrance. That's how history, I suppose, develops. But again, this is essentially a process of business seizure, completely illegal, of course. Whether this will actually be operated as a factory is not quite clear. Lots of these takeovers are also really about asset stripping, taking out lots of the metals and trying to make money in that way. Lots of reports, of course, about farmland. This is big agricultural regions. As I said, in the early period, lots of these seizures of farmland and horticultural businesses, a lot of greenhouses seized by, again, this mixture of Russian officials, but often sometimes local business people on the make, various people working with the Russian occupation authorities, or in some cases, and as in the case of these three big major Ukrainian agri companies, we see what appears to be a takeover backed by a big Russian corporation seizing huge amounts of land to add to their already existing big land holdings in Russia itself. Even if farmers managed to stay on the land, they were usually forced to renegotiate contracts, often forced to renegotiate or rewrite their paperwork of ownership also. And certainly they had to agree to supply to, in most cases, a single buyer, and obviously a buyer that could set prices below market prices. This, for grain farmers, this involves selling to this so-called state grain operator, set up in May 2022, which has been facilitating all these grain exports out of the occupied territories, particularly through Crimea, but also through Russia into Rostov, mixing then into the biggest of Russian grain exports, which makes it very difficult to trace where they're going. But there has been good work on this, and I should say, this report in many ways is a collection of all the good investigative journalism that's been going on in the last 18 months on what's going on in the occupied territories. But a very good story from the FT from last year about Syrian flag vessels being used to essentially steal Ukrainian grain and export it to Syria. You can see there big increase in wheat exports to Syria from Sevastopol, rose more than 17 times in 2022. Obviously, Syria also under sanctions. So this provides a kind of channel of export that is quite lucrative for both the Russian occupation authorities, the businesses connected to them, and of course for businesses involved in Syria as well. We have also seen some reports of grain being taken out of Mariupol port. Mariupol port has been revived, reconstructed in various ways, and the Russian Ministry of Transport has included them now in the Russian Register of National Ports. And you can see all these plans for developing this regular shipping route across Sea of Azov, linking Mariupol into Rostov-on-Don, and providing an alternative logistical link into Mariupol, which is turning out to be quite important. Particularly, they're using this to import thousands of tons of construction materials and export grain from the occupied territories on the way out. Some of that going into Rostov again by boat. And there you see the figures are from Russian official figures of 24 grain ships who left Mariupol port in the first 6 months of this year. And this, as far as I understand, is increasing quite significantly. I wondered if I could just show a quick video clip because I think it's quite interesting to see how Russian officials are normalizing what is clearly illegal activity, this illicit export of grain from the occupied territories is not going on in secret. It's not, there's nothing hidden about this. Indeed, it's completely celebrated on, for example, the Roskapstroy website. They've got a YouTube video about it. And local officials are often celebrating the fact that they are now exporting grain again through Mariupol port. So I wonder if I could just show you just 1 minute of this. I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's important to understand the way that Russia is trying to normalize the discourse around occupation, around the economic occupation. So I hope this will work on your screen as well. It's just a very short clip. So I just wanted to show you that clip because I think it's a good way of understanding how Russia's trying to normalize this process. You see there, it's a kind of this is modern Russia, right? Smart young executives going down to Mariupol to manage this business, setting up a logistics center. But actually, everything we see going on there is essentially a form of economic crime, including, of course, the export of grain. But you can see what's happening there in terms of the logistics, bringing in a lot of construction materials to the site itself. So obviously, for businesses that have remained in the occupied territories, is a rather different situation. So we saw there with the farmers obviously being pressured a good deal to try and force them to sell to the occupation authorities. They don't have an awful lot of choice. So while those who've left the territories can only really look from afar and see their businesses being taken over by Russian forces and by Russian corporations, see them as being essentially re-registered, as we saw in Russian corporate rules. We also have still quite a large number of Ukrainian business people who have remained. According to officials, maybe 30% remained in Mariupol, perhaps slightly higher in places like Melitopol, Berdyansk and others. But they obviously face this huge range of pressures. Lots of talk about informal taxation, essentially shakedowns by local militias and so forth. And then in terms of actually working, lots of local entrepreneurs, I think, being squeezed out by incomers, by new Russian companies, by politically connected companies who are willing to cooperate very closely with the occupation authorities, for example. And then, of course, even more difficult perhaps is that they now have to follow Russian rules and regulations imposed on business. They're required to use Russian banks, register for Russian taxes, buy, if necessary, Russian licenses. And this is all pushing Ukrainian business into a very uncomfortable position of, if they want to survive, if they want to keep an income going, if they want to maintain ownership of their property and their business, they're being forced essentially to cooperate, or under Ukrainian law, it might be seen as collaboration with the occupation authorities, and this is creating huge numbers of problems. So just to flag a couple of these, one is that in banking, of course, all Ukrainian banks have been forced to close, and they've been replaced by a couple of banks that are largely impervious to sanctions. That's Pромsvyaz Bank, which is essentially the bank that is used by Moscow for the military-industrial complex. And then the Center for International Settlements Bank, which is a kind of successor to a rather odd bank that some of you may remember was operating in the Donbass for a while, and had been routed through South Ossetia as a way of getting through a loophole in sanctions. And that's now become the Center for International Settlements Bank, bank still with very unclear ownership, to be honest, but now registered in Moscow, doesn't have that South Ossetian link to it. And this creates obviously a problem that businesses need access to banking to survive, as indeed do many residents. But it's quite difficult to open a bank account in a Russian bank without a Russian passport. And so a lot of people, for all sorts of reasons, just to negotiate this administrative occupation of their lands, are being forced to apply for a Russian passport, for Russian ID, essentially to survive within this new environment. And I don't know whether we can trust these figures or not, but certainly you're seeing a lot of people applying for passports, a lot of people taking them up. That's just 1.5 million. That of course includes people in the former DNR, LNR, which are, you might expect slightly higher uptake there than in perhaps Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast. But nevertheless, although the figures may not necessarily be completely accurate, certainly enough anecdotal evidence suggests that people do feel, in some cases, forced to take on Russian passports, and that is creating potential huge problems, of course, for the future. Some of this fits into welfare. I mean, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the people who remained in the region have been those who perhaps couldn't afford to leave. Very high number of elderly, pensioners, often people who are unwell, and they're therefore particularly vulnerable. There have been reports that, for example, Russian authorities are not providing access to health, to public health for people who refuse to take up Russian passports. I don't know if that's universal or not, but certainly those reports have been there. And many people's really surviving on this rather small humanitarian aid package that the Russians give out every month, and a 10,000 ruble monthly payment that pensioners and others get. If you do get a Russian passport, then you do start to get access to these bigger welfare payments, and that is obviously valuable, particularly for families with young children and pensioners. And therefore, you can see Russia trying to sort of buy off parts of this population. Often those welfare payments are rather more than people would have got under Ukrainian rule. But nevertheless, that sort of attempt to co-opt part of the population, we can discuss whether it's being successful or not. Anecdotal reports suggest that opposition to Russian rule remains certainly at a very high level, and that in most cases people are taking on passports essentially because they have little choice in order to survive under the Russian regime. So there's all sorts of ways for Russian companies and well-connected political operatives and businesses to make money in this occupation. As we've seen, they can seize Ukrainian property, seize Ukrainian business, loot and plunder. But there's also another way to make money, and that is from this huge multi-billion-dollar reconstruction campaign that Russia has launched. The focus of this is in Mariupol, of course, destroyed by Russian attacks, a huge amount of destruction, most famously or infamously, the dreadful attack on the drama theater in the center of Mariupol, now again being reconstructed, but in which hundreds of people died in that attack, of course. So Mariupol in particular has now become the sort of site for all sorts of property seizures, redistribution of assets, but also enormously lucrative contracting deals to take advantage of this huge amount of money that is flooding into the territories. Most of these tenders are completely opaque. Very little is transparent. The amount of money going in is not clear. And the opaque tenders, of course, tend to favor the insider companies that you might expect, either linked closely to the Ministry of Defense or in some cases to, for example, St. Petersburg authorities, which have a twinning arrangement with Mariupol. And the same goes in other parts of these regions where construction is also going on. It's not only in Mariupol, but Mariupol is really the heart where the biggest investments have been made. The bottom picture there, you may remember President Putin's visit to Mariupol, and he visits this new micro-district that is now a sort of standard feature on all the Russian propaganda videos, propaganda tours of Mariupol, built very quickly by the construction company of the Ministry of Defense. Come on to that in a minute, but that's been a really sort of symbol of what Russia thinks it's trying to do in Mariupol, this kind of model city that it thinks it is building. And we've seen this put forward in this rather glossy brochure, so-called master plan for Mariupol, full of detail on lovely parks that will be built, public transport, environmental sustainability, a very glossy front to essentially the horror of the deconstruction of Mariupol and the destruction that went on there. But I think, we can all see a precedent for this, right? Think about the reconstruction of Grozny, officially called this campaign of No Traces of War, a deliberate attempt in Grozny to cover up the conflict, to sort of forget about the conflict, to use architecture as a kind of collective forgetting. And the reconstruction campaign in Mariupol is also seeking to erase that evidence of Russian war crimes, trying to erase the evidence of what went on in Mariupol during the siege, but also importantly, I think at the same time, to reconstruct Mariupol as a purely Russian city and obliterate all the evidence of Mariupol's history as a Ukrainian city, including all the monuments, of course, that were there, including a monument to the genocide in the 1930s. That brochure that you can look up online if you have a chance is a classic case of trying to essentially obliterate an entire history of Ukrainianness on the ground. So this architecture and this reconstruction is not some kind of relatively innocent part of this process, but one with a much bigger political agenda behind it, and of course a kind of corporate and financial agenda that accompanies it at the same time. And some of those corporate interests are tracked in the report. You can have a look through. There's been some good investigative journalism on this as well from some of the independent Russian press and from Ukrainian writers also. Ministry of Construction is really overseeing this through their single contractor system. But of course, that subcontracts to numerous companies, most of them very well connected, many of them from Moscow. But the scale of this, I think we shouldn't underestimate what is going on. It is huge. Some of it, of course, we might question how effective it actually is. But nevertheless, the scale and the planning here is quite reminiscent of kind of Soviet projectivism in the 20th century. Husnulin, Deputy Prime Minister, who is overseeing this, calls this the biggest development project in modern Russian history, and he may well be right. Lots in the report about the sort of corporate aspects of this. Just that micro district Nevsky that we just saw Putin visiting, built by the Военно-строительная компания of the MOD, overseen by a deputy minister. Lots of stuff about him, also on social media, of course. But you can see the way this works, subcontracts to a company, which also has close ties to the MOD. Other major companies involved, really quite interesting to dig into those. ESK, for example, Arstroy, set up after the war began, apparently with the sole purpose of being involved in this process. And then just briefly, I wanted to mention this regional shift because I think it's quite interesting. This is a kind of twinning process in which different regions are given different parts of Ukraine to invest in or build up. St. Petersburg, I mentioned, is the key one, twinned with Mariupol, and funding reconstruction again through a rather opaque fund, so-called Победа Fund, and including the reconstruction of Mariupol theater, site of that terrible bombing, of course. But what they're trying to do here is shift the cost of reconstruction onto the regions, and also in a way to get regions involved in the war, to make sure that they can't sort of sit back and wait and hope that it all ends, but instead, as it were, get them involved in the whole process, including sending personnel at various points to these twinning districts. Also, I should say, within those regions, these regional ties are also producing this kind of school visits and children being taken out of this region. You see them on these rather grim tours of St. Petersburg at times. So there's a lot more to this than simply reconstruction as well. So what's happening here? I think there's a couple of things that are quite interesting. One is that there's an emerging segment of Russian business, not maybe the biggest level of oligarchs, but certainly a sort of new layer of what you might call sort of war entrepreneurs who now have a kind of vested interest in the occupation and the war. Many of them quite well connected to the Ministry of Defense. Again, remember the Ministry of Defense has this burgeoning budget and a huge range of subcontractors working around it. Found out a little bit about that from the Wagner story, but Prigozhin was certainly not the only one, of course, involved in that contracting arrangement. Now that is becoming an important way of making money during the war. As we've said, seizing and managing Ukrainian assets is lucrative. This whole smuggling campaign, illicit exports out of the region, and the subcontracting and the government reconstruction campaign. This is all giving a new element to the occupation that is really creating a kind of vested interest, both in some Russian companies and in that small proportion of local people who are collaborating with the Russian regime and have a vested interest essentially in it remaining in power. Is any of this really as good as Russian propaganda suggests? Obviously not. Lots of stuff on YouTube and elsewhere on the reality of this. Many local residents still homeless in Mariupol, waiting for new apartments. Apartment blocks sometimes being demolished, even though perhaps they could have been saved. Some stories that new luxury apartment blocks are being put up, targeting Russian buyers. There's been reports of new real estate market opening up to Russian buyers looking for, investments by the sea in Mariupol. And so you get these, I think, well-founded fears of essentially de facto ethnic cleansing, large-scale immigration from Russia, which would be part, obviously, of that Russian plan for the region in the future. And that's the danger, of course. The longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be to retain a hold on the territory, and the more integration you will find essentially in bureaucratic and administrative terms with Russia as we go forward. So what does all this mean? What are the policy implications? I mean, I think there's several here, and some of them are complicated, some of them are quite sensitive, but I think nevertheless important to discuss. I think the first policy implication is that we shouldn't underestimate how much this is helping to consolidate Russian rule. Obviously, in the end, this all depends on what happens on the front line. It all depends on Ukrainian counteroffensive. And I talked up above about these Ukrainian Russian banks setting up all their new branches. Well, they also set up branches in Kherson City. They had to abandon very quickly. They set up branches in Kupiansk, in Kharkiv Oblast, also had to abandon very quickly. So let's not forget that this economic occupation can also be reversed. But I think as we see a slowdown in the counteroffensive, it's becoming even more important to focus on what's actually going on under Russian rule and the extent to which Russian economic policy is trying to normalize occupation, if you like, undermine potential resistance from the population, using those economic levers in ways that it's actually pretty good at to try and co-opt local business, discourage support ultimately for a return of Ukrainian governance, or at least undermine overt resistance to Russian rule. And then, as I say, you're getting these Russian business now with interest in maintaining the occupation. And then a reconstruction program, also pretty useful for domestic propaganda, right? This vision of a new Russia, things are happening, I also see complaints, of course, people say, well, there are schools being built in Donetsk Oblast, but not in my own locality. That may backfire, but I think for the most part, in terms of TV pictures and overall propaganda, this is quite useful for Putin as he goes into the election next year. And as I said, there's a likelihood of in-migration, which again will start to change the nature demographically of the territory if this occupation goes on for a longer period of time, as indeed we've seen in Crimea. Secondly, this all makes it much more difficult to reintegrate the territories that have been under Russian rule. Relatively simple, of course, to take back Kherson City, for example, after a few months. But after a longer period of this kind of administrative occupation, you start seeing, if nothing else, an incredibly complex legal process that has to manage all these range of simple day-to-day bureaucracies, marriages, births, deaths, business transactions, things that may be considered unlawful under Ukrainian law, but have nevertheless happened under Russian occupation. People sell their houses, people do some kind of business, and then we get onto the sensitive questions of collaboration and cooperation with the occupying powers, which is going to be difficult both politically and legally to manage in the post-war situation. And more broadly, of course, there's this question of difficult polarization, often between those who left the territories and those who stayed. These kind of relations are difficult. And also, of course, between those who are seen to have collaborated with the Russian occupation and those who have not. But, of course, this is a big gray area and one that is becoming something that, to the credit Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian lawyers have worked on quite significantly. On collaboration, again, a sensitive topic, and particularly sensitive perhaps for outsiders like me to talk about, but nevertheless, I think there's something here in terms of the international experience that might be useful to bring to bear. We saw March 2022, this new law or new amendments to the criminal code brought in very quickly for understandable reasons. It was needed at the time, I think, but there are articles in this Article 1111 and Article 1112, which essentially try to define collaborative activity. And you can see there, I just picked out one aspect of it, which is the transfer of material resources to illegal armed or paramilitary formations, or formations of the aggressor state, or any economic activities in cooperation with the aggressor state. Now, of course, that does cover a huge amount of potential activity that is going on at the same time, and that creates potential legal problems going forward. And there have been some very good reports by Ukrainian human rights groups looking at the problems with this current law and indeed how it's being implemented, because it's often being implemented in different ways in different parts of the country. And they come to the conclusion that it may well criminalize legitimate activities, including humanitarian aid, running a grocery shop, and of course, this question of taking up a Russian passport, opening a Russian bank account, and so on and so forth. So a huge number of problems here, and indeed the Ukrainian head of the prosecutor's office for Crimea and Sevastopol claims that, for example, looking at Crimea, almost anybody living in Crimea over the last few years would almost certainly fall foul of this collaboration law. And he's been arguing for a more nuanced approach, particularly in relation to Crimea. Obviously, I think there is a new law now in the Duma looking at this. This is very much a live issue, but it is one that not only is about the post-war situation, of course, but is also about making sure that Russia can't use this rather dangerous narrative that encourages local people to be fearful of the return of Ukrainian governance and Ukrainian control. When Russians left Kherson city, they did manage to persuade quite a lot of people to leave with them, whether rightly or wrongly, and they will be working on that kind of scaremongering among the local population as well. Very briefly, because I'm coming to the end, just want to flag that many of these activities are obviously illegal under Ukrainian law, but they're also potentially illegal under international law as well. Now, Russia, of course, doesn't acknowledge that it's an occupying power under international law, but that doesn't matter. Its actions meet the criteria of such a designation, and as the occupying power, it should have these extensive legal obligations. And under successive agreements of international law from the Hague Convention onwards, pillage and plunder, in other words, the forcible taking of private property by an invading army, has been outlawed successively in successive codes of international law over a very long period of time. And the same repeated in the Rome Statute of the ICC, where pillaging a town or place is also seen as a war crime. Appropriation of property is seen as a war crime. So many of these property crimes and essential property thefts may well fall under the mandate of international law. It is also true that it's been very difficult in the past to prosecute these kind of crimes, economic crimes under occupation. But nevertheless, I think it's important to put that out there because it is another way of putting pressure, I think, on Russia, and in particular on people who are thinking of investing in the occupation territories and conducting business there. So we need as many potential avenues as possible to try and dissuade Russian business from doing so. And sanctions is one of those. Different views, of course, on how effective it is. But I think, although there have been sanctions on many officials in the occupation regime, it's not always a systematic approach, and there's some quite glaring gaps and loopholes at times. So a more coordinated, comprehensive approach might be one way to look at it. So very briefly, three big takeaways, I think, from this in policy terms at least, is that, you know, with the military situation somewhat uncertain, we also need to find other ways to put pressure on the Russian occupation regime in southeast Ukraine. And one of those is to try to make it less attractive for Russian business to work there, to pay more attention to the economic crimes that are going on, to increase the potential for sanctions on people working in the occupation structures, for example. This is not going to be a very fast or necessarily comprehensive approach, but I think it's just one part of a wider toolbox that I think we should start to think about in terms of expanding our approach, not only relying on military campaign, but also looking at political and economic tools as well. Secondly, I think there's a lot of information out there. Some of it obviously is being gathered by Ukrainian prosecution authorities, and quite rightly, of course. But I think there's also scope here for some more collection and collation of data, partly as a way to try to find justice in the future, but also to try to resolve legal issues going forward and ensure business restitution in the aftermath of the war. And then finally, of course, this question of transitional justice, which is hugely complex and includes these questions about collaboration that are going to be very difficult. And again, here I think there is some international experience. It may not be completely applicable to the Ukrainian situation, and Ukrainians themselves obviously will have to work through these difficult issues in their own society. But I do think there are some areas where the international community could also help a little bit on trying to explore different avenues to how to go forward with that. So I will leave it there. As I say, this has been a real focus on the economic aspects of the occupation. If I could do a little plug for this book coming out spring next year, I will be looking also at very important aspects of military rule, the violence, but also the propaganda, the educational campaigns, the cultural aspects that are threatening to really obliterate Ukrainian culture from southeast Ukraine. So a whole range of issues there. So please do follow up, and I'll be very interested to talk to anyone who is also doing research in this area. It's very much a collaborative project and program, and we hope to go forward with this over the next few months. So please do get in touch if you think you can contribute or think you've got ideas on where this this kind of research might go forward. Thanks very much.
David, thank you so much for the great presentation. So we'll start collecting questions to you, and while we're waiting for the first ones, probably I'll jump in with mine. So after all of your studies of this mechanics behind the occupation, how would you interpret Vladimir Putin's decision to do that back in September of the last year? Was it intentional? Was it well planned? Do you see that this is a long-term strategy, or it was kind of a, in a sense, impulsive, or at least it seemed impulsive, right, back then?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's different, you can reasonably hold different opinions on that. My own view is that at least one of the options, even prior to the war, was annexation at least some of these territories. I think it's very unlikely that anybody in the Kremlin thought in, January 2022 that they would end up with these four oblasts as their sort of primary territories of annexation. Obviously, they were aiming for Kiev and the north. They might have thought Kharkiv was more likely. I suspect they thought they could reach around to Odessa at least. So I think a lot of this has been developed on the hoof. There's been a bit of ad hoc decision making. You remember even back in sort of April, May last year, there was a lot of discussion about, are they going to have referendums? Are they going to join Crimea in some new territory? Are they going to be independent, proxy states for a while? So I think those debates were real, but I think there was always some strand of opinion in the Kremlin that quite liked this idea of simply going forward with the annexation, partly because they saw Crimea as this huge success from their point of view, but also I think in a way, Putin's trying to lock in any kind of successor into this escapade. He doesn't want these gray zones anymore, which might at some point in the future be negotiated away by going through this whole rigmarole of fake referendums and annexation. Makes it much harder for a new president to come in and say, yeah, I'm sorry, we got it all wrong. We'd like to give these lands back to their rightful owner. I think it does have this unfortunate way of locking in Russian elites and potentially locking in a successor to this territorial aspect of the conflict that I think is going to be quite difficult to unravel.
Great. So it seems that we discussed everything, more or less. I mean, it's impossible to discuss everything.
We solved all the problems. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's yeah, I mean, there's obviously some very difficult questions around what this means for reintegration and reconstruction from the Ukrainian side. What do you do, for example, with the Russian reconstruction that's been going on if and when Ukrainian forces win back that territory? The questions about collaboration I talked about, obviously really difficult. And this broad problem of sort of social polarization between those who stayed and those who left. I think these are all going to be really big questions going forward, and ones that obviously are being discussed in Ukrainian society, but for the West and for externals who are thinking through what reconstruction might look like, I think it's worth bearing that in mind as we go forward, and just trying to understand a little bit more about the mood on the ground, the complex dynamics of the economics, and how much this is really sort of consolidating Russia's hold, even of at least part of the population in Southeast Ukraine.
Thank you so much, David, for your great presentation. It was really insightful. And once again, the presentation, the part of our conversation will be on YouTube, so you can always follow up. David's report will be on our website. You have all the links in the comments. And we hope to get around once again sometime soon to discuss a new portion of your research.
Thanks so much for hosting. Really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for contributing.